The 24th of November in the year 260. A town called Oxyrhynchus in Roman Egypt on a branch of the Nile about 160 kilometers south of where Cairo now stands. The money changers have closed their windows. These are the men who sit at the tables where the empire's coinage gets turned into other coinage, who take your handful of small change and give you the silver you need to settle a debt or pay a tax. They are the plumbing of the imperial economy. And they have shut all of them at once. The local magistrate posts a notice about it, and that notice survives, a scrap of papyrus, catalogued and translated. It says the bankers have closed their banks on account of their unwillingness to accept the divine coin of the emperors. He orders them to open and to accept and exchange all coin except the absolutely spurious and counterfeit, and he reminds them of the penalties already ordained. Hold on to that document because of what it is not. It is not a philosopher complaining that the youth have no morals. It is not a chronicler writing a century later. It is a piece of routine local administration dated to the day, and what it records is that in the autumn of 2060, the subjects of the Roman Empire were refusing to take money with the emperor's face on it. So let me show you what had happened to that coin. Under Augustus, the silver denarius weighed about 3.9 grams and was effectively pure silver. 25 of them bought 1 gold aureus. That standard held, almost untouched for 90 years. By the reign of Trajan Decius, in the middle of the 3rd century, the standard silver coin was down to around 40% silver. Under Valerian, about 20. In the coins struck around 266, about 5. And by the end of the reign of Gallienus in 268, roughly 2.5%. Officially, on paper, 25 of them still bought a gold piece. Nobody had ever announced otherwise. In metal, you would have needed something in the order of 600. Hold on to that gap, it is the whole story. Because that is not a debased silver coin anymore. It is a bronze coin that has been dipped in a silver bath. Now, here's the fact that turns this entire story inside out, and it is the reason this video exists. While all of that was happening, while the silver was being taken out of the coin decade after decade for 200 years, the price of wheat in Egypt barely moved. We can check this. Egypt is the only place in the entire Roman Empire that has left us a usable run of prices because Egyptians wrote on papyrus, and papyrus survives in dry sand. And the series shows prices and wages essentially flat from the 70s through the 160s, and flat again from the 190s all the way to the 270s. There is one bump in between. Between the 160s and the 190s, prices roughly double once and then stop. That is the window of the Antonine Plague, a demographic shock, not a monetary one, and the historians who work on this series put it there. And I have to give you the caveat because it is also the punchline. Egypt did not use the imperial coinage. It had its own sealed currency system, a base silver coin that no Roman outside Egypt would ever have handled. So strictly speaking, these prices measure the Egyptian coin, not the imperial one. But look at what the Egyptian coin was. It was tariffed at exactly 1 denarius, year after year, decade after decade, while the silver inside it drained away just like everywhere else. Egypt is not an exception to this story. Egypt is the story with the receipts kept. 2 centuries of debasement, no inflation to speak of. And then, in 274, an emperor did something different. He put silver back into the coin. He made the money better. And prices went up roughly tenfold. So the question this video exists to answer is not why Rome debased its money. Every state that could, did, and most of them got away with it. The question is why the repair was worse than the damage, and what that tells you about what money actually is. Let me give you the thesis in 2 sentences, because both of them are going to be uncomfortable. The first is that Roman prices did not follow the metal. They followed the label. For 200 years, the emperors quietly took the silver out of the coin while leaving the number on it alone, and almost nothing happened. The moment a government changed the number, the whole thing moved. And the second is the deeper one. By the 4th century, the Roman state had stopped having 1 currency and started having 2, a gold coin that stayed almost perfectly stable for 700 years, which the state and the great landowners used, and a bronze coin that shrank, without end, which was what everybody else was paid in. Rome did not simply debase its money. It protected its own money and let the money of its subjects die. And it built a tax system that forced those subjects to buy the good coin in order to pay for the privilege. Now, one thing before we start, because I'm not going to spend 30 minutes leading you somewhere I do not believe. Money did not cause the fall of Rome. No serious historian working today argues that it did. One German scholar went through the literature and counted 210 different causes that have been proposed for the fall of the Roman Empire, and inflation is one entry on a very long list. And there is a single fact that kills the simple version stone dead, which we will come back to at the end. The eastern half of this empire inherited exactly the same coinage. the same mints, the same debasements, and the same reforms. It lasted another 1,000 years. So this is not a story about bad money destroying a civilization. It is a story about what a state does when it runs out of options, and about who pays when it does. This is the history you were not taught. To understand any of it, you have to start with a fact about Rome that is genuinely strange to a modern person, and it explains almost everything that follows. Rome could not borrow. There was no bond market, there was no national debt, there was no institution that lent to the Roman state and expected to be repaid with interest over decades. The one time anything like it happened was an emergency levy during the wars with Carthage, and that was a compulsory contribution from citizens, not a loan from financiers. The Roman Empire ran on cash permanently, with no facility to spend money it did not have. Which means that when an emperor needed to pay an army the day after tomorrow, he had exactly 3 options: tax more, conquer somebody and take their silver, or make more coins out of the silver he already had, by putting less of it in each one. For the first 2 centuries, the second option did a lot of the work. Rome expanded, and conquest paid. And then in the 2nd century, the expansion stopped. After that, the third lever is the only one that can be pulled quickly. Now look at the bill. Under Augustus, the empire had 25 to 28 legions. Under Septimius Severus, 33. And Severus did something even more expensive than adding legions on his deathbed, according to the tradition. He told his sons to enrich the soldiers and despise everyone else, and he had already put that into practice with the first serious pay. Rise in over a century, his son Caracalla raised it again. I have to be careful with these numbers, because the actual rates of Roman military pay are genuinely disputed, and the estimates in the scholarly literature differ by a factor of 2. But the direction is not disputed, and the multiple is what matters. On the standard reconstructions, the annual cost of the legions rose by something like 3.5 to 5 times between Augustus and the end of the 3rd century. And the money went out of the state and stayed out. When historians look at Roman coin hoards, hundreds of them, what they find are the fingerprints of military payments clustered in the frontier provinces in the right denominations, in the right sizes. The coin left Rome, went to a soldier on the Rhine or the Danube, and came back slowly if it came back at all. So a fixed tax base, a rising army bill, no ability to borrow, and a mint, you can see the shape of the next 2 centuries already. Which brings us to the first man to touch the standard, and to a correction that changes how you should read every chart you have ever seen about this. In the year 64, Nero reduced the weight of the denarius from 1/84th of a Roman pound to 1/96th, and reduced its fineness. And here is where I have to interrupt myself, because almost every number you will find online about Roman silver content is wrong, and the reason is interesting. The standard figures came from analyses done in the 1970s which tested the surface of the coins. But the Romans deliberately treated the surface of their coin blanks to draw the copper out and leave a silver-rich skin. So a debased coin tests pure. When metallurgists finally drilled into the cores, the coins turned out to be significantly worse than the accepted figures by something like 15 percentage points. Nero's coin, long listed at around 93% silver, is closer to 80, and the same haircut applies to every 2nd and 3rd century figure I am about to give you. Only the numbers at the very bottom of the collapse are safe, because those were drilled rather than scanned. The Romans, in other words, were not only taking the silver out, they were finishing the coin so that you could not see it. But, and this is the correction that ruins the simple morality tale, the same metallurgical work found something nobody expected. The emperors kept putting the silver back. Domitian took the denarius back up to pure silver in the year 82, then deliberately brought it down again 3 years later. Trajan pushed it down once more in the year 100. Others pushed it back up. Across the first 2 centuries, the fineness goes down and down again, repeatedly. And the researchers who did the drilling concluded that this looks like men who believed the coin ought to contain its silver and restored it whenever the treasury could afford to. That is not the behavior of a counterfeiter. That is the behavior of someone who keeps failing to keep a promise he still believes in. And here's where the story becomes genuinely fascinating, because in 215 an emperor found a way to debase the currency without appearing to touch it at all. Caracalla introduced a new coin. Modern numismatists call it the Antoninianus. It carried the radiate crown, the spiked headdress that on Roman bronze coinage had always marked a double denomination. It contained about 1.5 denarii worth of metal, and it appears to have been tariffed at 2. I should say plainly that no ancient source states that rate. It is an inference from the crown and from the weight. But if it is right, then what Caracalla did was create a coin that told you it was worth 2 by a visual convention, while containing the metal of 1.5, and the difference went to the treasury. The state had discovered that the number on the coin and the metal in the coin were two separate things it could move independently. It abandoned the new coin 4 years later. And then, 20 years after that, when the money ran out again, it brought it straight back. And after that, the floor gives way completely, because the 3rd century arrives. Between 235 and 284, the Roman Empire went through 50 years of near-continuous civil war. At least 26 men claimed the throne. The count depends on who you are willing to call an emperor, and some historians get to over 50. Add a pandemic that ran for more than a decade, a Persian invasion that captured a sitting Roman emperor alive, and the loss of whole provinces to breakaway regimes. Every one of those claimants needed to pay soldiers immediately, and none of them could borrow. So the fineness falls off the cliff I showed you earlier, and it lands at around 2.5%, a floor mapped so precisely that a numismatist wrote a paper about it and called it simply the nadir of the imperial coin in the reign of Claudius II. That is the world the money changers of Oxyrhynchus were sitting in, and there is a detail about their strike that makes it sharper, not weaker. The coins they were refusing were the brand new issues of 2 men who had just declared themselves emperors in Syria after Valerian's capture. And metallurgically, those coins were no worse than the ones the bankers had been accepting the week before. The specialist who has looked hardest at this concludes the refusal was political. Nobody knew whose face was going to be worth anything by spring, which tells you exactly what this whole video is about. What was failing was not the metal. It was the belief that the number on the coin would still mean something tomorrow. And early in 271, in Rome itself, something happened that has no parallel in Roman history. The workers of the imperial mint revolted. The Latin sources call it a war, the bellum monetariorum, the war of the mint workers. It was led by a man named Felicissimus, who was not a laborer. He was a rationalis, a senior financial official of equestrian rank, which is to say one of the most important men in the imperial monetary administration. The reason they fought is stated in the sources without embarrassment. They fought, in the words of one of them, poene metu, for fear of punishment. There had been fraud at the mint of Rome on an enormous scale, and it had 2 forms. They were clipping the coins, literally shaving metal off the edges, and they were stealing the silver, substituting lead. We know this is not just slander, because it is in the metal. When the coins were assayed, and this work goes back more than a century, the pieces struck at Rome in this period turned out to carry, on average, only about half the silver of coins struck in the same years at Antioch, at Siscia, at Tarraco. And they carry other things too: zinc, tin, even traces of iron. An audit was coming, and rather than face it, the men who made the empire's money fought the empire's soldiers on the Caelian hill inside the walls of Rome. Now about the casualty figure, because this is where documentaries go wrong. 2 late sources give the same number, 7,000. One of them is the collection of imperial biographies known as the Augustan History, which is one of the most notoriously unreliable texts to survive from antiquity, a work attributed to 6 authors who did not exist, written by one man about a century after the events and stuffed with letters and documents that are outright forgeries. And the detailed version of the 7,000 figure, the one that helpfully lists which military units took the losses, sits inside one of those fabricated letters. A scholar reviewing it a century ago concluded it had no historical value whatsoever. So here's what I will tell you. 7,000 is the only number we have, and it comes from sources that cannot carry it. What the figure genuinely establishes is not a body count. It is that Roman memory filed this episode under war, a war fought inside Rome's own walls, about the quality of Rome's own coins. What happened afterwards is not in doubt, even if the order of events is. The mint of Rome went dark for roughly 3 years, and one serious reading is that the closure came first, and is what the mint workers were fighting about. The Senate lost its ancient right to strike the bronze coinage, and never really got it back. Felicissimus's post was abolished outright, and in a detail that tells you exactly what kind of emperor Aurelian was, he pardoned a portion of the surviving rebels and took them off to fight in the Balkans. And then in 274 he did the thing this whole video has been building towards. He reformed the coinage. He raised the silver content of the standard coin from around 2 or 3% back up to about 5%. He put a mark on it, xi which most numismatists now read as a declaration of the alloy itself, 1 part of silver to 20 of bronze. Whatever it meant exactly, its purpose is not in doubt. It was there to be seen. He revived the old denarius as a denomination and restruck the bronze. By every metallurgical measure, the money got better. And in Egypt, in the years around that reform, prices went up by something like a factor of 10. Read that again because it is the single strangest fact in Roman economic history. 200 years of quietly removing silver, prices flat. One reform that puts silver back, prices multiply by 10. I want to be careful about the causation, because the coinage of Egypt was being re-tariffed in these same years. under Aurelian's predecessor, and again under his successor. And some historians put the movement there rather than in the reform itself. So the honest statement is that the explosion happened in the years around Aurelian's reform, not that Aurelian personally caused it. But the pattern behind it has been worked out, and it is the intellectual core of this video. A scholar going through the evidence found that there is no evidence of any change in the official tariff of Roman coins before 274. For 2 centuries, the emperors changed the metal and left the number alone. And for 2 centuries, prices in the only place we can measure them stayed flat. Then somebody changed the number, because that is what a re-tariffing is. It is a public announcement made by the government that the coin in your hand is not what it was. And the instant that announcement is made, the shared fiction that has been holding the system together, the fiction that a denarius is a denarius, stops working. The state's mistake was not taking the silver, it was admitting it. And if you think that is a one-off, watch what happens 27 years later, because the next emperor to try it left the receipts carved in stone. Diocletian reorganized the coinage in the mid-290s, and on paper it was everything a reformer could want, a stabilized gold piece. A new silver coin of 95% fineness or better. The first properly good silver Rome had struck in a century, and a large bronze piece with a silver wash for daily use. One coin was 95% silver. The other was 5, 19-to-1 on purity, and even allowing for the fact that the daily coin was 3 times heavier, the good piece still carried 6 or 7 times the actual silver. And that is exactly why it failed. Nobody spends the good coin when the government has priced it below what the metal in it is worth. The fine silver went into boxes and under floors, and the daily money stayed what it had been. It did not hold. And on the 1st of September in the year 301, he issued an edict about money. We know its contents because a copy was carved on the wall of a public building in the city of Aphrodisias, in what is now Turkey, and archaeologists have been piecing it together since the 1970s. What it did was double the face value of his own coinage. Not the metal, the number. Now count the months. Somewhere between the November 20th and December 10th of that same year, call it 3 months later, the same government issued the document that everyone actually remembers, the Edict on Maximum Prices. More than 1,000 entries. Every commodity, every wage, every freight rate in the empire, with a legal ceiling on each. And the penalty, stated in the preamble, is death. It goes further than that. The death penalty applies to the seller who charges more, it applies to the buyer who colludes with him, and it applies to anyone who withdraws his goods from the market rather than sell them at the fixed price. So put those 2 documents in order, because in sequence they are one of the most damning things any government has ever done. In September, the state doubled the nominal value of its own money with a stroke of a pen. Prices in that money doubled, because that is arithmetic. In December, the state made the resulting price rises punishable by death, including for the shopkeeper who responded by simply not opening. It manufactured the increase, and then it criminalized the consequences. One honest objection, and then I will let it stand. 3 months is not much time for a currency decree to travel an empire and show up in prices, and one historian argues that the increase the December edict was chasing had really been building since a reform 7 years earlier. Maybe. But the state did double its own numbers in September. It did make the resulting numbers a capital crime in December, and it never once mentioned the September decree in the December one. We have one narrative account of what happened next, and I want to name its bias before I read it, because it matters. Lactantius was a Christian writer whose entire book is an argument that the emperors who persecuted Christians came to bad ends. He is a hostile witness writing about a decade later, and his numbers are rhetoric. He is also contemporary, and he is all we have. He writes that when Diocletian's various injustices had produced an immense scarcity, he attempted to fix the prices of goods by law. And then, much blood was shed over trifling and cheap items. Through fear, nothing appeared for sale at all, and the scarcity blazed up far worse until the law, after the deaths of many, was abolished by sheer necessity. Even the historians who distrust every word of that keep the core of it, because the documentary record agrees the edict was being ignored within a few years, and there is no surviving text repealing it. It did not fall. It just stopped mattering. 60 years later, an emperor named Julian tried the same thing at Antioch, capped the price of grain, watched the grain vanish, imported wheat from Egypt to sell at his own fixed price, and watched that vanish too. He responded by writing a satirical pamphlet attacking the citizens of Antioch. An emperor of Rome, reduced to arguing with his own subjects in print about the price of bread. Now we come to the part of this story that actually explains the next 1,000 years, and it starts with a coin that worked. Sometime around 310, in the mint at Trier, the Emperor Constantine began striking a new gold piece. 72 to the Roman pound, about 4.5 grams, essentially pure gold. It was called the solidus, and it did not change. Not for the rest of Constantine's life, not for the next century, not for the next 5 centuries. Under its Greek name, it was still being struck at the same weight and the same fineness in the 10th century. Serious debasement of that coin does not begin until the middle of the 11th. Roughly 700 years of a stable gold currency in a state that had just spent 2 centuries destroying its silver. So the Roman Empire absolutely could produce sound money. It proved it, and then it maintained the proof for 7 centuries. The question is who got to hold it, and the first part of the answer is simply arithmetic. A working man in the late empire earned something in the region of 3 to 5 solidi a year, 3 to 5 coins, which means the solidus was not money in any sense a laborer would recognize. You could not buy bread with 1/3 of a year's wages, and nobody was making change for it. It was an instrument for taxes, for soldiers' bonuses, for buying land, and for settling large accounts. It was, functionally, the currency of the state and of the people who dealt with the state. The second part of the answer is in the tax code. Constantine introduced a tax on trade. It fell on merchants, on moneylenders, on anyone taking a fee for a service, and specifically on craftsmen who sold what they made. And from the late 4th century, it had to be paid in gold. Now, here's the exemption. Landowners were not liable for it, nor were peasants selling the produce of their own fields, nor doctors nor teachers. To be fair to the Roman tax code, landowners paid the land tax, and the land tax was the largest revenue line in the empire, but the land tax could be paid out of what the land produced. This one had to be paid in gold. Read that as a piece of engineering, and it is unmistakable. The man with an estate is exempt, the village blacksmith, the weaver, the potter, the shopkeeper, they pay, and they pay in a metal they are never paid in, because they were paid in bronze, and the bronze kept dissolving. Across the 4th century, prices measured in the small change of ordinary life rose by something in the order of 50,000 times, which the study that reconstructed the series calls the strongest inflationary period ever experienced in antiquity. Under one emperor alone, they rose about 20-fold in a handful of years. If you want to see what that looks like on the ground, the Egyptian records let you follow one commodity. At the start of the 4th century, a measure of wheat costs a figure in the low thousands of the small unit of account. By the middle of the century, the same measure is quoted in the millions. Nothing about the wheat had changed. It was the unit that was falling out from under it, year after year, in the only money most people ever touched. And here is the mechanism that ties it together from the same study. The silver that the state kept putting back into its better coins was, to a significant degree, silver stripped back out of the debased coinage already circulating. They took the silver out of the people's money to top up the state's. So put yourself in that village. You are a weaver. You are paid in small bronze coins whose value against gold falls every year. Your tax is assessed in gold. You do not have gold, so you must buy it, and you frequently buy it from the same people who are collecting the tax. The exchange rate is the tax behind the tax, and no law had to be written to create it. That is the 2-tier system. And it did something to Roman society that no invasion did. The stable gold accumulated in the hands of state officials and great landowners, who converted it into land, which produced more gold. The historians who study this period describe a new aristocracy of enormous wealth rising in exactly the centuries when ordinary people's money was dying. And the final proof that the state itself knew its money had failed is that it stopped asking for money. By the 4th century, a large part of Roman taxation was collected in kind: grain, oil, meat, uniforms. The state levied things because things do not lose their value between the harvest and the treasury. Think about what that means. The Roman government would not take, in payment, the small coins the Roman government was making. It still wanted its own gold. It just would not touch its own bronze. When the tax collector will not take what the mint strikes, the currency is already dead. Everything after that is administration. And the administration went in one direction. From 332, there is a series of laws ordering that a cultivator who runs away from the land be returned to it, one of them specifying that a man planning to flee should be bound in servile condition with iron, and that whoever shelters him pays his tax. I have to be careful here, because modern scholarship rejects the old idea that there was a single, coherent institution of serfdom created by these laws. So the honest version is narrower, and it is enough. From the 4th century, a growing body of Roman law tied the cultivator to the plot of land that carried his tax assessment. The same happened to trades the state depended on: bakers, shippers, miners, armorers, bound to their occupations and their sons after them. And among those hereditary corporations, bound by law to the workshop, marked so they could not disappear into the population, were the workers of the imperial mint. A century after they fought the imperial army in the streets of Rome over the quality of the coin, their descendants were legally chained to the bench. Now, I want to be careful here because this is the exact point where this subject gets stolen, and it gets stolen constantly. There is an enormous body of online material that presents Rome as the original cautionary tale about paper money, that the emperors discovered the printing press, that Rome suffered 15,000% inflation, that this is what always happens to a currency backed by nothing. Almost every part of that is false, and some of it is false in the opposite direction. Rome had no printing press, no paper money, no fiat currency, no central bank, and no public debt. It could not print and it could not borrow. It could tax, conquer, or shave the coin. That is the entire menu. The figure of 15,000% does not appear in any academic study I can find. It circulates in online articles that attribute it to unnamed historians and economists, and it traces back through a chain of secondary citations to a handful of price comparisons made across gaps of a century or more. What the actual literature says is more interesting and less quotable. Careful work on the 2nd century puts inflation at well under 1% a year. The late 3rd century is where it becomes serious. And across the 4th century, the best study gives a rise of something like 50,000-fold, vastly bigger than the number the pamphlets quote, and for a reason those pamphlets get exactly backwards. And a large part of even that is not inflation in the sense you are thinking of. When the government doubles the face value of its own coin in September of 301, every price expressed in that unit doubles overnight without anything real happening at all. The unit of account moved, the bread did not. But the deepest reason the Goldbug version fails is the one it cannot survive. Rome's money was made of metal, and it never stopped being made of metal. There was never a piece of paper, never a promise, never a printing press. And yet for 200 years it circulated at a value the metal in it could not possibly justify, because the state said so and everybody went along with it. That is a fiduciary currency, in everything but the material. Rome did not fail because its money was fiat. If anything, it failed because its money had quietly become fiduciary, while everyone, including the government, was still pretending it was bullion, and the pretense only broke when the government broke it. And I owe you the other correction too, the one that cuts against the title of this video. The coins are not the cause of the fall of Rome. The historians who dominate this field now argue about external pressure and the arrival of the Huns, about a measurable collapse in material living standards, about chronic civil war, about climate and pandemic disease, and they argue with each other sharply. Where money sits in that debate is as an instrument panel. The coinage tells you the state was under fiscal strain long before anyone wrote it down, because the coins were made by the same people who were running out of options. That is a real and useful thing for a currency to be. It is not the engine. And the fact that settles it is the one I promised you at the start. The eastern half of this empire inherited all of it. The same debased silver, the same solidus, the same tax on trades payable in gold, the same laws tying men to land. Constantinople fell in 1453. It had another 1,000 years. So whatever destroyed the West, it was not the coinage, because the East had the same coinage and did not die of it. What the East had, in the flattest analysis of it I know, was a better geographical hand. A narrow strip of water, 700 meters across at its narrowest, separates Europe from Asia at Constantinople. Behind that water sat Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt, out of reach of any army coming through the Balkans. And the imbalance had been there all along. The richest, oldest, most densely taxed provinces of the empire were in the east. The great standing armies sat on the Rhine and the Danube, in the west and the north. The money was raised in one half of the empire and spent defending the other. When the halves separated, one of them kept the revenue and the other kept the frontier. The West was holding the Rhine and its stretch of the Danube at the same time. And then in 439 it lost North Africa, its most profitable province, and the granary of Rome. The tax base collapsed while the military bill rose. That is the fall of the West, in one sentence, and the coins are the record of it, rather than the reason for it. But the East did one more thing, and it is the ending of this story. In the year 498, the Emperor Anastasius abolished the tax on trades, the one payable in gold, the one landowners were exempt from and blacksmiths were not. And in the same reform, he rebuilt the small change, new large bronze coins in a proper series, with their value stamped on the face in a letter you could read. A 40-unit piece marked M, a 20, a 10. He reopened mints to make enough of them. For the first time in centuries, an emperor fixed the money that ordinary people actually held and told them plainly what it was worth. That is what this story is really about, and it is why the title of this video is only half the truth. Rome did not fall because it debased its money. Rome debased the money of its subjects for 200 years, and almost nothing happened, because the label held. What broke was something else. It was the moment the state started maintaining one currency for itself, hard, stable, and beautiful, while the currency it paid its subjects in kept dissolving, and while it wrote a tax code that forced those subjects to buy the good money from the people who governed them. That is not inflation, that is a transfer, and it ran for 2 centuries in the same direction. And it ended with a state that no longer trusted its own coins enough to accept them, taxing in wheat and oil, binding men to the fields and to the workshops, because when your money stops working, the only lever left is force. Here's the part that has not aged. Every monetary system has a 2-tier problem waiting inside it, and it has nothing to do with what the money is made of. Some people are paid in a thing that reprices itself: land, a share, a rent, an index. Everybody else is paid in a number that was fixed last year. When the value of money moves, it does not move equally. It moves against whoever is holding the number. Rome is the purest case in history because you can see it in the metal. One coin stayed perfect for 700 years, the other rotted in people's hands, and which one you held was decided by where you already stood. The empire that let that happen came apart. The empire that eventually fixed the small change lasted another 1,000 years. That is not a moral about gold. It is a moral about who a state thinks its money is for. If you made it this far, drop a coin in the comments, so I know you stayed until the end, and tell me where you land on the strangest question in this story. For 200 years, Rome debased its coinage in silence and prices held, because nobody in charge ever said out loud that the coin was worth less. In 274, an emperor finally told the truth about the money, and the price of wheat went up tenfold within a few years. So, should a government ever admit that its money is worse than people think it is? Or was Aurelian's honesty the most expensive thing any Roman emperor ever did? I read every one of them. If this kind of deep dive is what you come here for, subscribe. It genuinely helps these keep coming. I'll see you in the next one.